What I am is not my own choice. You should pity me, not judge me in my torment. You think I wanted this? All I ever wanted of life was to live and love. I never had it, but I'm gonna have it now.
How can you speak of love when all you do is kill?
I kill to exist. Death is my life. It's a force I can't control.
Why don't you call that force by its right name? Your force is the devil.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome to a very special Halloween episode of Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I'm your host, Ian Garcia, and joining me as always is my father, Rocco.
Hello.
So, we're coming to you on a very dark and stormy night indeed, but hopefully when you're actually listening to this, you haven't been rained out of any of your spooky festivities. Although I would say a dark and stormy night is probably the best time for settling down with a good, scary movie. And for this Halloween episode, we've decided to settle down with another of Dad's personal favorites. One that he's wanted to cover for a while, way back in season 1, I believe it was, when we were covering some of the movies that he had a personal fondness and memory of from those old drive-in and shock theater days of television and movie theaters and drive-ins. I remember him talking about Curse of the Undead, this 1959 Universal International film, but we didn't cover it for that first season, so we're now finally covering it for Halloween. And I kind of want to start off just by having Dad sort of introduce it in the sense of like what he hasn't seen it obviously in decades, and I really don't think Curse of the Undead is one of those movies from this period that is the most remembered. I think part of it might be that Curse of the Undead, in this period of Universal horror and science fiction movies, it definitely comes at the very tail end of Universal's mid to late 50s cycle, which is far more dominated by science fiction than it is by horror. And I think for another thing, Curse of the Undead is a movie that is often forgotten because in the year it comes out is also the period shortly after, and in order, really, it seems fairly obvious, in order to capitalize on the success of a much more famous and prolific vampire movie, which is to say, of course, Hammer Films' Dracula, which was, of course, released in the United States as Horror of Dracula in order to avoid confusion with the original Universal film. But I'll open it up to Dad to give his introduction of like where this movie places in terms of his memories of the period and why it sticks out in his mind as something that he's wanted to cover for a while.
Well, it's never seen. I mean, you go on TCM or one of those, you can't find it. It's never played like the other ones are. And I remembered it. In fact, you're the one that called it out. I just remember it was about a cowboy who was a vampire. And I saw it as a kid. So when you see it growing up, obviously you appreciate all the nuances of it differently. And also you appreciate or come to know or you come to find out the drawbacks of the film also when you get older. And, after going through this whole series. So it stands out to me as something that's not watched by many individuals, probably hasn't been seen by many individuals. And I think it's just worthwhile watching. It's a worthwhile watching movie. It's got an interesting concept of a Western vampire that's a gunslinger by trade, who always wins because whether he's late or early on the draw, he's killing his opponent.
He's invulnerable to anything that they can do to them. Yeah, it's really a cheap trick, if there is one.
And the other thing about this is that growing up my generation, all these people you look at, Eric Fleming, Michael Pate, Bruce Gordon especially, John Hoyt, Edward Binns, these are all serial actors that we saw countless times in other series. For example, Rawhide. We saw them in the Andy Griffith Show. Bruce Gordon was a mainstay in The Untouchables, opposite Robert Stack.
Yeah, and
So-
Untouchables was only about to start showing up on television a few short months after Curse of the Undead was released. So a lot of these actors are being broken in Curse of the Undead and in these B movies before they sort of become these character actors sort of gain a much more prolific life on television.
And Eric Fleming, I said, why do I get confused with with Leslie Nielsen, because he plays a captain of a spaceship in
Leslie Nielsen does in Forbidden Planet.
but he does in the Queen from Outer Space.
Yeah, Queen of Outer Space. I believe that's the Curtis. No, that's not the Curtis Harrington movie. The Zsa Zsa Gabor film where they
Is
go
that
to
Zsa Zsa
Venus
Gabor?
and
That's right.
it's
Yes.
a rat planet run by women.
Yeah,
We
that's
haven't covered that one yet, but it looks very, very cheap and
It
very,
is
very
cheap.
cheesy.
It's not worthwhile.
But yeah, let's talk about this movie in the context not just of screen horror, but the screen western. I have a very interesting quote from a journalist writing for Chicago Sun-Times on November 11th, 1957. Quote, "This was a tense time in Americans' lives, so they find temporary solace in the Never Never Land of monsters or in the stereotyped pattern of blazing six guns and galloping hooves. For escapism, too, is behind the long-sustained allure of the Western." He goes on, "The next trend is inevitable. Some smart producer will connect both themes into a single storyline, and we will have the horror Western." It's very interesting, Curse of the Undead, because while it is not the first American film to fuse elements of either horror and science fiction with the Western, there's precedent in that regard in terms of a 1926 independent silent film called The Haunted Range, for instance, which, according to Kieran Fisher, who wrote a very good article on the origins of the horror Western for the website Film School Rejects, this movie centers around a mystery of a ranch that's supposedly home to a phantom, which I've never seen The Haunted Range, but just hearing that title makes me think that, of course, the idea is, the phantom in question turns out to be kind of a red herring. And so we can see how The Haunted Range is less of a horror Western as it is a Western twist on contemporary old dark house mysteries, where just like a lot of pre-30s and sound era so-called horror movies, these are movies in which the supernatural is always a hoax. There's always a rational explanation for it. It's always a smokescreen or a red herring for people of duplicitous means.
Right.
But even after that, the Republic Pictures long-running Three Mosquitoes franchise, which included John Wayne in its cast, the 1937 entry Riders of the Whistling Skull, is very interesting because it quotes, "Sees the titular threesome embark on an expedition to find a lost city. This brings them into contact with a native cult and some mummies." Closer to the science fiction arena, Curse of the Undead was also beaten to the punch by two previous independent shockers from the 50s. The first being, of course, The Beast of Hollow Mountain from United Artists in 1956, which we've already covered, and a lesser-known movie called Teenage Monster from 1957, which was released as a double feature with The Brain from Planet Arrows.
Yeah.
So there's this precedent for ahead of Curse of the Undead. But Curse of the Undead is often cited, I think, very appropriately as the first definitive work of the horror Western, because I think it is and it's a very interesting film to the extent that as a vampire movie, it's very much built upon the standard template of, say, a Dracula movie. You have an outsider of sort of unknown origins who has some vague, noble roots in a past lifetime, who weasels his way into not only attaining land, but stealing a woman out from under the hands of this this native-born hero who then has to turn to the supernatural and the occult in order to defeat the vampire in this kind of melodramatic, infernal love triangle. But it's also very interesting in terms of the Western genre, because it is very much obviously a film which is being made, just as that reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times points out, to capitalize on the contemporary success of Western TV series like Rawhide, Have Gun Will Travel, and others that were among the highest rated television programs of the 1950s. And I think it's very interesting as a Western because it also almost fits into the paradigm of the revisionist Western. For despite the fact that it's a sort of a horror movie plot, a tremendous amount of the movie is given over to debates of like the limits of the law and vigilante justice and the nature of morality. And in a really weird way, you can see the vampire in this movie as being something of a dark twist on the vigilante outsider heroes of the Western film. I think there's a lot of thematic parallels between the character in this film, Drake Roby, and other Western anti-heroes like Shane or John Wayne's character in The Searchers. These characters who have this, in a very real way, a kind of mythic power and a willingness and an ability to engage in ruthless violence in order to do what is necessary to destroy corruption and evil and reestablish order, but who themselves, because of their very nature, cannot be incorporated into a civilized society. Mm-hmm. But I guess we have more than an ample time to get into that as we get into the meat of the episode. But let's say we go ahead with a plot synopsis, because we have a relatively meaty drama that we need to get into, I think, before we can adequately discuss the film. So John Hoyt plays Dr. John Carter, a rancher and physician to an Old West town currently being plagued by a mysterious illness that seems to only affect young girls. Carter and his daughter Dolores, Kathleen Crowley, arrive at one of his patients' homes one evening where Dolores' fiancé, preacher Dan Young, Eric Fleming, is already giving spiritual consolation for a seriously sick girl. Carter is himself consoled to see his patient's health marginally improving, but it's only a short while when everyone is away that they hear a scream from her bedroom and return to find her dead, sprawled across the bed as if ravished by an animal. Preacher Dan takes note of 2 peculiar puncture marks on her neck. Gee, I wonder what that's from. Doc Carter has more problems to contend with than just the paranormal. An unscrupulous neighboring rancher by the name of Buffer, Bruce Gordon, is trying to crowd Carter off his land. He's sabotaged his fences, rustled his cattle, and more recently has even dammed up the river. It was while trying to blow up the dam that Carter's son, Tim, played by Jimmy Murphy, got caught by Buffer's gang and beaten up. The impetuous Tim is out for blood, but Carter insists on heading back into town and taking his complaints once again to the local sheriff, played by Edward Binns. The sheriff, though, can do little more than issue Buffer some harsh words, and on his way back home, Doc Carter is stalked by a mysterious lone rider clad entirely in black, played by Michael Pate. By the time Doc Carter's buggy returns to his ranch, he's still in it, but he keels over dead in his children's arms, Preacher Dan making note of the same peculiar puncture marks on Doc Carter's neck. Doc Carter is laid to rest the following day, but while the procession leaves the family crypt behind, nobody notices the black rider sneaking in, opening up Carter's coffin and seeming to disappear inside. Tim, convinced that it was Buffer who done his father in, gets drunk at the saloon and tries goading Buffer into drawing his gun so he can have a pretext to shoot him dead. Well, the first part of Tim's plan works out all right, but the second part goes the opposite of how he expected. With her father and brother dead, Dolores decides to hang up flyers for a hired gun. Preacher Dan is dead set against it, but the powerlessness of either God or the law in the face of injustice alienates Dolores from her fiancé. She says,
"If the devil can stop some of this pain in me, then I'll even pray to him."
And speak of the devil, the Black Rider arrives at her doorstep, revealing himself as one Drake Roby. Roby and Preacher Dan are immediately at odds with one another, and Dan in particular notes Roby's queer, almost pained reaction to a special button he wears on his lapel, featuring a small cross allegedly carved from a thorn found at the site of the crucifixion. Still, it's Dan who Dolores insists on leaving, whereas Roby is given room and board. That night, Roby not only begins feasting on Dolores' blood, but even finds his way back to the family crypt, opening Tim's coffin and taking a nap inside, apparently moving the body.
Yeah, it's never shown.
Yeah, we never really figured out what's up.
sense.
That's one of the more confusing things about the movie that's never really resolved, but I think we'll have a moment to unpackage why some aspects of the movie are a little too confusing.
They are.
I think it's a developmental
Yeah,
problem.
yeah.
Something got lost in the weeds somewhere.
Well, that's okay. That's go ahead.
Yeah,
Continue
yeah.
to-
Having spent the night working with the sheriff to find a way to protect Buffer's life and convince Dolores to fire Roby, Dan returns to the ranch the next morning to find the abnormally cold Dolores already acquiescent to the plan. Dismissed, Roby leaves without argument, and Dan and Dolores spend the evening looking over legal documents pertaining to the ranch and its previous owners, a Spanish family called the Robles, who sold the place after a family tragedy. Unable to open a safety box belonging to the Robles, Dan decides to take it home, and then Roby shows up. With an infernal chemistry between them that both transfixes and terrifies Dolores, Roby reveals that he's slowly going blind, progressively unable to handle walking around in the sunlight. Unable to carry on in his profession, he proposes staying on as a kind of night security for the ranch. Dolores accepts and offers him a cottage close to the cemetery, which suits Roby just fine, given that he needs to sleep in those coffins. Meanwhile, Dan cracks open the safety box and, in a secret compartment, discovers a diary kept by the ranch's previous owner, Don Miguel Robles. In flashback, we see how Don Robles' eldest son, Drago, obviously the soon-to-be vampire Drake Roby, murdered his younger brother Roberto after catching him having an affair with his bride Isabella. Consumed with shame over his actions, Drago in turn takes his own life and is thus damned to return to the earth as an undead vampire, taking Isabella's life in the process. Apparently, Don Robles had attempted to kill Drago in the family crypt, but because he used a silver dagger instead of a wooden stake, Drago escaped and implicitly has been wandering the West ever since as an invincible hired gun. Flashing back to the present, Dan is of course struck by the conspicuous likeness that a daguerreotype of Drago bears to one Drake Roby. Strangely enough, Drago or Drake does seem to have more on his mind than just bloodlust. During the night, while he once again visits Dolores' room, he does not drain her blood, only kissing her on the cheek. But he remains ruthless as ever. When the sheriff shows up to warn Dolores to dismiss Drake from her ranch or he'll run Drake out of town, Drake attacks the sheriff as he's leaving the ranch and satiates his hunger with him instead. Drake immediately goes after Dan as well, but Dan manages by chance to get Drake caught in the shadow of the local church's cross, repelling him. Running to his office, Dan is cornered there by Drake. They get into a long, tense talk before coming to blows, Drake ultimately gaining the upper hand and escaping with the portrait of Drago Robles.
And also the map.
Yeah, also a map of the old Robles ranch and the board and the boundary. Yeah, we'll get into it.
Right.
Dan goes to the ranch the next morning with the diary of Don Robles, but fails to convince Dolores, or maybe she's just in denial. When exhuming Drago Robles' coffin from the family crypt finds no body, only a silver dagger where Don Robles said he left it. Even this isn't enough. But Dan drives the final wedge between them when he realizes that Drake is sleeping in one of the Carter's recent coffins and insists on getting a court order to have them opened when Dolores naturally refuses the sacrilege. Using the documents from the safety box, Drake reveals an old map of the Robles land grant that details that its boundaries extend significantly into Buffer's ranch. You guys remember Buffer, right? With the law finally on his side, Drake luxuriates in going down to the saloon and watching Buffer squirm as he confronts him with the fact that not only is Drake about to take his land, but that Preacher Dan, good law-abiding God-fearer that he is bound to support him doing it. Buffer, incensed, is deft to Preacher Dan's pleas that Drake is just trying to goad him into a conflict, ultimately draws on Drake while his back is turned. Though Buffer licks off a shot right into Drake's chest, Drake is left standing, and Buffer dies right there on the saloon floor in Preacher Dan's arms. Returning to the ranch, Drake learns from Dolores that Preacher Dan is seeking a court order to open the coffins in the family crypt, whereas Dan realizes that he's going to eventually have to come to a duel with Drake to free Dolores. The next morning, Drake goes looking for Dan and finds him stepping out of the church, awkwardly tying on a gun belt. Drake challenges Dan to a duel, even letting him call the draw. Drake takes his paces, and when Dan calls draw, they both fire. Miraculously, Drake's previous crack shot seems to miss, whereas Dan's bullet finds Drake and drops him to the ground. Dolores arrives just in time to watch in horror with Dan as Drake's body seems to dematerialize, leaving only his black clothing behind. Picking his bullet out of where Drake's body used to be, we see that Dan had the tip of it specially embossed with the same cross from his lapel button. In the shadow of the church, Dan takes Dolores in his arms, and the two walk away from the horrific scene. So having not seen the movie in such a long time, how much did you remember about it, and how much is sort of freshly new to you? Like, what stuck out?
Freshly new to me was all the complexity of the fact that there's an understory here of, the lands and things like that, and Bruce Gordon's character Buffer, trying to gain more land, and the fact that they were rightful owners of 500 acres of Gordon's plot. And, I didn't, as a kid, you don't remember all that stuff. That's just filler, right? All you're interested in is the monster part of all the films. What other things I didn't, there's almost like a queer, the right word, erotic kind of, when he first opens the coffin, he smiles down on the body. It's kind of bizarre.
Like there's these, you're definitely right. There is a sort of, and I don't know that it's necessarily fulfilled in the film, but would it
it looks very weird, that's all.
There's this homoerotic kind of element to the movie that is never really fulfilled in full, but part of it really is embodied in both those scenes where Roby is in the family crypt. The first one where it's right after the funeral for Doc Carter, he goes into the crypt, he opens the coffin, and he kneels down, and you think he's about to suck his blood or something, but he just mysteriously seems to dematerialize. The coffin lid closes, and you're not sure what he's doing. It's kind of implied that he just gets right into the coffin with Doc Carter's body. And then a similar thing happens later when he goes to the crypt for Tim's coffin, where he opens Tim's coffin, and then we just simply we dissolve to a shot of him laying in the coffin, but we have absolutely no idea what happened to Tim's body.
You don't know if he absorbed the body?
Or did he devour it? Like, is this some weird sort of like, or did they become vampires? Is this like some like...
No, because there would be more of them. And that's the other thing. Well, a couple things fall apart there, but that I just thought was an interesting thing, and it was kind of bizarre. Obviously, he's not, because he's enthralled with Dolores Carter. He says, and he doesn't want to kill her because he says, "I love you," he tells her, right, before he bites her, and he just kisses her. And, of course, now she's under his control, sort of under his control and stuff like that. And I guess that's where Eric Fleming's character, Preacher Dan, has to come up to a point where, okay, I got to make a decision.
Yeah, I think that one element of the story we're actually seeing, like maybe the filmmakers. This is directed by Edward Dean and written with his wife Mildred Dein. I think in that element of the story, we're perhaps seeing like a kind of artsiness being deployed by this, this director-writer couple, because it really doesn't seem to have like a practical explanation other than the weird kind of incestuous metaphorical one that Drake that in the absence of her father and brother, that Drake coming into her life and doing these things for her, part of the way that he weasels his way into her life is that he becomes both weirdly like a brother and a father, and once Dan is alienated from her, he's like a lover as well, that he's literally that it's sort of symbolic of the fact that just as he's taking up the space in the crypt, he's literally taking up the space in her heart, this void that's been created by this trauma that she's experienced. It doesn't necessarily work in the context of a B drive-in movie.
I know, but the idea is what's complex about it is its rich dialogue. I mean, there's a whole segment in there where where the Eric Fleming character and he meet for the first time when he rushes into his office after being chased. And he says, "You should have pity on me. I was cursed to this. I don't think I want to live this way," says the vampire, Michael Pate. And you have that altercation between them. And there's a lot of rich dialogue that even in some of the scenes in the saloon even are rich in dialogue, in which, he says, "You look like a confidence man caught with his pants down."
Yeah.
There are lines in there that...
Well, also going back to that scene that was in the scene in Doc Carter's crypt, the scene in the crypt where he seems to go into the coffin. The script also seems to be peppered with dialogue that seems to be really preoccupied with like the sexual vulnerability and the feminization of men. And it's weird because Drake Roby seems to exclusively prey on women, but there is this element to the story where it's like, can he go both ways? There's always this sort of
all vampires
tension
can.
of
All vampires can, right?
Yeah.
So
there's this element of sexual threat. Like, it's like we
doesn't
can
matter, right?
Yeah, we can even think back to Dracula, where his brides attempt to go after Jonathan Harker or Renfield in the film version, but then Dracula immediately enters as like, "No, this one's mine. I get to go first."
Or even Interview with the Vampire.
Right, exactly.
It's loaded with it, right?
Well, yeah, this seems to, like, the fear of sort of a queer kind of, like, sodomistic sexuality seems to be a kind of preeminent fixation of the vampire genre.
Yeah.
But
another thing about him, Pate looks effeminate. He doesn't look like a macho. He looks he dangles, right? He doesn't walk with the...
He certainly has style.
His style.
I mean,
I think that could be aristocratic.
Yeah, that's the thing, and he is also playing this sort of... I think also it comes from, like, the sort of caricature of him being almost like a Latin lover.
Yes.
Like, instead of the erudite Eastern European of the original Dracula, now we're translating it to another sort of a stereotyped sexual fixation of American fiction in terms of the Latin lover as this man who is just consumed by passion even unto undeath.
Unfortunately, love once again is the fatal blow to these vampires.
Yeah, like it turns you into a schmuck. It makes you forget like what you're supposed to be doing. Yeah, exactly. But that is the interesting thing, isn't it? Because at a certain point he develops a loving sort of, and it is true, he does seem to develop a sort of loving fascination with Dolores, which is weird because you're never quite sure how much you can trust what he says. Because he is an undead vampire. He's a ghoul. He's fated to always find the most duplicitous and easy way to weasel himself into this person's life. He's parasitic by his very nature, but we do have that wonderful second scene where he goes into her bedroom. You think he's about to bite, and then he kisses her on the cheek. And then what's fascinating...
He says no.
Right, yeah. And then what's fascinating is that he leaves the room and she comes out to him in a sort of trance, and you're not sure, is he doing this trance or is he waiting? Does he have to have her come to him in order to do this? But then the weird thing is that in the very next scene, after the sheriff shows up to deliver his ultimatum to Dolores, so on the very same night that he's supposed to being able to, ravish Dolores, he ends up going after the sheriff instead. So again, you have this sort of element
Easy
of
pickings.
well, you have an element of the queerness again. Like
Yeah.
he's just going both ways, and if anything, it's almost like he can't get it up for just Dolores. There has to be this bridge between like
it's kind of funny because all the other victims were young women, right? Up to this point, and now he's crossing over. Now he's attacking males, right?
Right.
So he attacks the sheriff, right?
And in a weird way, maybe and that's the thing, he has a sadistic streak because he clearly gets off on the fact that he's like not only taking Dolores, but that he's taking her from Preacher Dan specifically. And I think part of it is like maybe there's that element of it where almost like she's almost a bridge to the person that he really wants to bite, he really wants to consume. That really it's Preacher Dan who he's after. Really it's him who he wants to, he wants to shoot his, I mean, the sort of like the phallic symbolism. He wants to shoot his gun in Preacher Dan, and Dolores is just a pretext to, getting off.
I don't get the feeling that he has a you have that conflict between good and evil. I don't get that so much in this, and I don't know if that I draw that same comparison or that same line of thought that he's really after. He's after Fleming. Eventually, he knows it's going to come to an ultimatum, but the idea.
But he seems to try everything to avoid it. Like that's the thing is that
right, and even at the point where they're arguing with Bruce Gordon's character Buffer in the bar. The preacher knows what he is, right? He already knows that he's a undead person, and that, but he had to agree with him that the actual map is probably correct. It's probably true that Buffer's land is encroaching, or vice versa.
That he's illegally squatting on someone else's land,
right?
Yeah,
but not deliberately. Obviously, this is drawn up before the final deeds were done for the property.
Yeah,
and
that's
I don't know. It's kind of funny. It's
and you're right. He doesn't seem as interested in the themes of good and evil as Preacher Dan is. Like that seems to be Preacher Dan's obsession. Like he's constantly talking throughout the movie, constantly talking about how we can't succumb to vigilantism. We have to follow the law. We can't become as bad as the murderers are. And I think that's and then of course when he does gun down Buffer, he does attempt to leave. He does attempt to do the things the right way. Obviously, he doesn't really, and that's the weird thing, because when he goes back to Dolores, he makes a big show of explaining to her, like, look, I didn't want to kill him. I was getting ready to leave. It's like I turned my back on him. I would have never done that in the past, and I think it's because you're influencing me to do it. And that's the thing. We don't know how much we can trust him as a character. But then again, I think but
he was smart enough to put either his flask or his cigar case in his lapel on the left when she sees the bullet wound through his heart. He says, well, he shot you right through the heart. How come? He said, yeah, but it wasn't for this. And he pulls out the silver casing,
right,
which is either his flask. Couldn't make out, but I think it was a cigar case, a metal cigar case. And he put it back in the pocket. So he's smart enough to actually maybe move it or actually have it there or whatever.
Or maybe it was just a convenient excuse, if anything. I mean, and that's the thing is that, and I think part of what makes the movie so interesting, and I think part of the reason why when people see it today, because there are occasionally write-ups of this movie, because it is a very weird and interesting example of not only the horror film, but of the Western, because of that commingling of the genres. I think the thing that is often alienating to viewers is that there really aren't any characters who you can really identify with, because on the one hand, you can never really trust Roby's motivations. You never really know what is an honest expression of like the human being who has been taken over by this dark force of sin and what is the force of sin itself. But also, every other human character, whether it's Preacher Dan or the sheriff or even Dolores, even there's a sort of dark irony that pervades the story, because, first there's the dark irony where Roby is the one who has killed Dolores's father, but Dolores is convinced that Buffer has killed both her father and her brother.
Right.
And, yeah, and there's this...
Well, that's true. Her brother was killed by Buffer.
Right, her brother was killed by Buffer, but not her father.
No,
and so there's this element of dark irony
right,
where...
Right.
So she doesn't know everything that we as an audience know. But then with Preacher Dan... he's such a feckless and impotent character. And that's the thing that's really sort of bleak about the movie, is that ultimately the vampire is the only one who
appeals to our characters.
Right, who appeals to our desire to see that Buffer, this just absolute reprobate, finally gets what's coming to him.
He appeals to our nature, our id, and our... Whereas Preacher Dan doesn't have any id. It seems like he's all... And it seems
he's
almost,
a goody two-shoes.
Well, but he's not. He's got strength, but there's something about him. Whereas Robles seems like he's... Drago Robles, or whatever now, Drake Roby, is now the... He appeals to us in a certain way because... And he calls Bruce Gordon the confidence man, when in reality, he's the confidence man, right?
Right, exactly.
But like you said, you really don't know for sure. You don't know if he's really earnest, or maybe it's because the human side of him that's no longer there still yearns to have some kind of humanness. And the fact that he challenges, as I said, Preacher Dan in the initial meeting, you should pity me. You shouldn't be condemning me. I don't want to live like this, but this is what the...
And that's the thing, is that, like, and that's why allegorically the movie is so interesting, because of course, like, this, if you took vampirism completely out of the equation, all you would be left with is a story about kind of like a psychopathic killer.
Right.
Who is using the pretext of being a hitman as a way to launder his pathology of violence. And so you could have the exact same scene where this man who is driven to kill is begging this figure of authority, look, I didn't ask to be made this way. I don't want to kill, but whenever I just seem to go everywhere. And, like a true psychopath, he's never responsible for anything. It's just dominoes falling. There's no personal human agency. Exactly. Yeah. He has this elaborate, and that's the other weird thing about him as like a vampire is like, and again, he's a vampire who does, in the sort of distorted, lawless context of the Old West, he does have a certain morality and an honor system to him that he doesn't, and it's this thing where it works both allegorically from a vampire perspective and also from a straight Western perspective, because the vampire cannot go where it's not invited.
Right.
So it's like, so implicitly, like, I can't infect any situation where I am not already wanted.
Right.
And so that in itself opens up so many other implications in terms of, like, how all these young girls in this town are suddenly succumbing to, like, this plague of vampirism. Like, know, what has Drake been doing all this time?
It's really funny. The pitfalls in the movie, like Carter saying, I scoured every medical book I could get my hands on, but he didn't notice 2 puncture wounds on people's necks.
Right, exactly.
There are a couple things.
He couldn't have been doing a very close examination of his patients.
I mean, it's very funny, but in my...
19th century modesty is one thing, but like it's just the neck.
The other thing is, you're right about...
you never needed to check their pulse.
Michael Payne, the Drake Roby's character, you're right, because he even says, when she offers to pay him the money anyway, he says, no, I don't take money for a job I didn't do.
Yeah.
Because he doesn't need money, he's a vampire.
Right, exactly. It's like, it's meaningless.
It's funny.
And what he's...
funny, he uses it, but you don't know if he uses it or if that's the human side of him saying there's some kind of honor code. Obviously, before he became a vampire, his aristocratic nature was more of an honor code. It's very, very
right, but and that's the thing. It's that, like, there's also this weird sort of like old world, new world mentality where it's like, okay, so this Spaniard, this passionate Latin lover, he comes from a culture where the culture of honor is governed entirely by passion. It's a culture of honor rather than a culture of civility.
Right.
So and because of that, like, he's sort of this chaotic character who can be good, but ultimately he destroys others and he is destroyed by his own mythopoetic fixation with the honor of a man. So like he then ends up running aground in this context where Preacher Dan is trying to, and the sheriff are trying to toe the line of the new world, where it's like, no, your personal sense of honor, your passions are exactly the problem. You need to control these things. We need to keep them tightly buttoned up. We need to, it's like, there's that great scene in the graveyard where they're Preacher Dan is pouring over the documents with Dolores, and he kisses her twice, but then he's like, well, I guess I gotta go to work and you gotta go inside. It's like, and then of course Drake Roby shows up, and then later one of Drake Roby's great lines is that as soon as you left, I was kissing your fiance. He says,
but it's amazing how little influence you have when you're not around.
That's right.
One of the for a movie that doesn't necessarily have a perfect script, one of the great all-time movie digs.
There are a lot of digs in it. There are a lot of like I said, you look like a confidence man with his pants down.
Yeah, I actually have a couple.
Little lines like that all through it. I mean, like that. The only one that I really have sympathy for is the sheriff. He seems to be the straight shooter. No pun, but just down the line, he seems to be the person that.
I actually have queued up a bunch of suggestive lines from the movie. If you want to hear them, we're kind of getting back to the sort of the feminizing kind of queer subtext at work in this movie.
Doc Carter's boy moves into my land, starts breaking things up. What am I supposed to do? Hold him in my arms and kiss him? Suppose Roby shows up tonight.
I'll tuck you into bed. One of your men can hold your hand.
You think you can lay any old map on me and I'll just bow my head and say amen? How do I know it ain't been rigged? It's been done before.
You're squirming like a confidence man with his pants down.
Well, I never thought I'd live to see the day when a preacher and a hired gun would get married.
That last one especially is fairly on the nose, and so
it's a lot of that, right?
Well, let me just unpackage a little bit of the background of this story, because again, this is 1950. This is 1959.
Right.
So what happens in 1957 when that article is being written in the Chicago Sun-Times? The year 1957 is one of the worst fiscal years in Hollywood history, and Universal ends up being hit so hard that the following year they kind of shut down production almost completely at the studio because they're just trying to reassess what their financial future is. They managed to squeak out a couple of really low-budget horror and science fiction movies, those being Step Down to Terror and Monster on the Campus, both of which were produced by Joseph Gershenson, who is the producer of Curse of the Undead. But production recommences on August 4th, 1958, and the first new horror film since the shutdown, another of the movies Gershenson is producing, is announced to be titled Affairs of a Vampire. And the way it's presented in the press is not the serious attempt at a kind of gothic western that we're given in Curse of the Undead. Originally, it's being pitched as a satire of vampire movies. And so this is how Edward Dean, the director of the film, semi-accurately describes the genesis, obviously embellished, of the movie. So, quote, "My wife and me were sitting around doing nothing, and one day she said, let's do a little writing just for practice. So I dove into the pool and came up with the craziest title in the world, Eat Me Gently. A Western..." This is from an interview with Tom Weaver. Dean uses the F slur for gay people. So just a heads up. It's not politically correct, but this is how he's describing the story as he wrote it. "Eat Me Gently, a Western horror story about a fag vampire running around the desert eating little boys. We wrote it as a screenplay. It must have taken...
never gotten past
Yeah,
that.
well, of course. We wrote it as a screenplay. It must have taken about 2 weeks. We had a lot of fun with it. We had mimeographed copies we had made with red covers with thick letters which said, 'Eat Me Gently.' We decided to hand these copies around to our friends for laughs. We went into Schwab's drugstore for a soda, and the first person we saw was Rose Gershenson, a friend of ours and a real doll. We told her with straight faces that we had just completed a sensational screenplay for a horror film called Eat Me Gently. Everyone around the table looked at each other. There was no smiles, no laughs. They just thought it was tremendous. What an intriguing title. So Millie and I Mildred, that is. So Millie and I played it straight, and Rose said, "Why don't you let me give it to Joe?" We couldn't very well say no. The following morning, Joe called us up and said, "Hey, smartass, the good stuff you don't give us, I want you to make this picture. I'm not only going to make it, I'm also going to give you a second screenplay to do, The Leech Woman. How do you like that title?" I told him I loved it. He said, "Well, I don't like your title. We are changing it to Curse of the Undead." So we had Michael Pate play it straight, and this became a legitimate vampire picture. So the gestation, and obviously it's a little inaccurate, they changed it to Affairs of the Vampire, and it was originally promoted, at least as it was when it was announced as being in development, it was originally promoted as a satiric film. But somewhere along the line, it became a serious Western, and it seems to me that a lot of the sort of weirder, inexplicable elements about it are indeed vestiges of the fact that where it gestated from was that it was very much supposed to be like a gay vampire movie.
And I thought there are a lot of funny. You heard me laughing a couple of times. There are lines in there that just dropped me.
And apparently, according to Tom Weaver, in the original shooting draft of the screenplay, there's even more dialogue like that, like little suggestive lines peppered throughout. And Tom Weaver also, in his audio commentary for the film, this is his description of how that coffin scene where, the scene where he disappears inside the coffin, this is how it was originally scripted.
But you didn't serve it up right. It doesn't. He opens the coffin slowly. And then that smirky smile, that sickening smile comes across his face.
It's not just sickening; it's perverted.
Perverse. Yes.
Yeah, like
that's deliberate. That's not.
Yeah, that's not subtle at all.
No,
but so here's Tom Weaver's description of how it's originally written in the screenplay.
The script says that Drake's eyes are filled with sympathy when he lifts the coffin lid and looks down at the body of the doctor. Then it calls for a shot of the mausoleum wall and ceiling, and on them we see Drake's shadow as he leans over the coffin and goes down, and then the lid goes down. Quote, "And as it closes shut, both the shadow and the figure of Drake are nowhere to be seen. For an instant the candles flicker, then blow out. The faint light passing through the window slowly fades as night falls. The tomb is black. A strange, heavy breathing permeates the scene, ricocheting through the mausoleum. The faint, awesome sound of flapping wings suddenly emanates. It is muffled as if coming from the coffin. It grows louder and louder. Intermingled with the breathing, the sound is horrendous," unquote.
So not only and again, there's greater emphasis to everything, and I never really thought about how the fluttering of the candles has both horror implications, but it also has like sensual implications, like the candles, and of course here's the thing, as the scene, because he's right, the scene as film does take place in the daytime, but originally as it was scripted, as he described, the camera was supposed to pan to the window where the candles are, then it was supposed to scene change to night. And if you know anything about these classic movies during like the height of the Hays Code period, which we're still in the midst of, we're still having very harsh controls over what you can do in a movie, panning from characters to a window in the day and then transitioning to night and then panning back is the coded sign that these characters got down.
Right.
And so not only are we having that transition in the originally scripted scene, we were also supposed to hear the sounds of heavy breathing coming from inside the coffin
and flapping wings.
Yeah, exactly. So if it's not homosexual, it must be implicitly, but it's also like there's this weird necrophilia to it. Like the idea was that like Michael Pate's character, even after they had decided they were going to do it as more of a straight horror movie, the idea was that Michael Pate's character was supposed to be a lot more perverse than he ended up being.
Or complex.
Yeah.
Right. And I think those elements stay in the film
Yeah, I mean, there's this. You're right. There is this almost dandyish quality to Michael Pate, because at the end of the day, you're right. It's like, yes, he's this sort of invincible guy who throws thugs around and who's always got the right lines. But at the end of the day, he's only able to do it because he is a confidence man.
Right.
He's got the upper hand through some duplicitous trick. In reality, all that needs to happen is for a real man like Preacher Dan, who doesn't need to do talking. He doesn't need to dress all in black. He doesn't need to threaten people. And when the time comes to throw down, when he's up against a real man, let's say that Drake Roby immediately,
the point is,
he deflates immediately.
yeah, the
let's
point
say.
but he does deflate literally.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
But I think the other thing that, I mean, we're talking about some of the overtones that were done by the original writers who wanted something more of a sexual intuition or a double entendre. You see that in the jokes. Homoeroticism in a way. And I think that's very interesting. And I think one of the most, I guess, poignant and disturbing is, and although it's not very what you call graphic, it's the takedown of the sheriff.
Right.
Which has to last at least almost 40 seconds for him to bring him down slowly. And the sheriff is fighting, and you can't tell whether he's biting him or kissing him.
Right.
Because it's from behind in shadow. And the gradual submission into death of the sheriff while he's being obviously sucked dry. We didn't know that because it doesn't look like that. It looks like he's either strangling him or something else. But it has that kind of feel that it looks like almost like a forced love scene. And I thought that was very interesting for the directors actually and the photographer actually to do it that way.
Yeah, I think at least so far in the vampire films we watched, obviously this is made about a decade after like the latest vampire film we watched from the 1940s. But yeah, there is an element to it where like even in the 30s, you know, the deaths depicted in vampire movies were never particularly graphic. In this one, you're right. I think it is telling that the one really graphic on-screen killing in the film is male on male rather than male on female.
Yeah.
You know, that tends to be implied, whereas, you know, we do get this and you're right. I do think it fits into the pattern of the film, which seems to be in a very understated and I guess we should say compromised way, because these are elements of the story that they kind of had to weed out once they decided that they weren't making a satirical film. They were making a serious Western horror melodrama.
Right.
But it sort of goes to the persistent theme that's still evident in it, which is the emasculinization, the feminization of the male characters, where it's very telling that Drake Roby ravishes the male victim far more graphically and explicitly than he does the female
and
ones.
Maybe, I don't know if that was because of code, maybe male on female was more coded back then, not coded, but terms of...
Well, it might have be seen as more obviously sexual,
right.
Particularly given that, you know, it with the female scenes, you know, he's literally going into Dolores's bedroom and like kissing her on the neck and on the cheek. And of course, there's the teenage girl at the beginning of the film. I think, you know, what's very interesting about the first killing scene, which is all off screen.
Right.
I think it's very interesting that once they enter the room, the first thing we see is the curtain flapping on its spool in the window, implying that someone has just, you know, ducked out of the window really quickly. And of course, there's all the implication of like rape imagery is very obvious.
That's
there.
Right.
Just
yes,
as
absolutely.
And so you get the transference of the depiction of this violence against a young female character going all the way to this much more masculine and authoritative male character, all of which implying the sort of queer subtext that Drake Roby can go both ways.
Right. But the point is that, but I think now I'm looking at the film and the writers wanted to focus on Drake Roby.
Right.
So Eric Fleming's Preacher Dan character is unfortunately not complex.
Right.
And that's the drawback of the big film. He's the lead character, but there's not enough complexity in him to really show the countervening forces here. Maybe it's and it really accentuates Drake Roby's character.
Well, he's also astoundingly unsympathetic, at least within the conventions of the Western movie, because he's got this fiance who this absolute deplorable asshole is crowding on her land, who everybody is convinced, before they even know about Drake Roby's character, everyone is convinced that Gordon had something to do with the death of Buffer, had something to do with the deaths of both her father and her brother. But he's just, he just doesn't do anything about it.
That's what I meant. There's something about him that's not complicated enough. And it's always this goody two-shoes kind of thing that makes you, it's almost treacly sweet.
Like, at least have a scene where he's, like, praying with God, like, at least have a scene where he like, needs to seek spiritual counsel for, it's like, I want to kill Buffer so bad. I want to take a gun, I want to put it in his belly, and I want to shoot him until he's dead. It's like, you're right, and there's... But
well, at least even the sheriff says that. Boy, is there anything... Because he even says, that I would do anything to have you dead, but obviously we're people that we can't have you get killed.
Right, we need to do it. But it's also the most... Because in a weird way, they're also bound by, just like Drake Roby's character, they're bound by this weird code of honor, which says, well, it has to be in self-defense. But the great thing about the movie is that there are, like, at least 2 major scenes that illustrate the utter stupidity of this sort of cult of self-defense, because ultimately it boils down to really insecure male characters using, school ground, like playground insults just to goad another man into getting so mad that he wants to murder you, and then using that as a pretext to murder him. Like, there's like, it's all pretext. Everyone admits that it's all pretext. Like, people are saying both scenes.
Well, it is, but it is the era where the gun is a tool. I mean,
but
the idea is that, I mean, there's not much you could, I mean, how else do you do it when there isn't a law, and you do have, for example, property rights to kill someone on your property. You do, all those things were, and you hung someone if they stole your horse, because a horse meant you would die if you didn't have it. If you're out in the middle and someone takes your horse from you, you can die in 100-degree heat. So the rules are set up that way. So I agree with you, the fact that it's taken advantage of. There's no doubt about that.
And it's almost...
But I wouldn't say necessarily that it's not... There isn't some rationale for it.
I'm not saying that there's no rationale. Everybody has a rationale, but I'm saying, like, maybe this is, again, maybe it's part of the sort of lingering vestiges of satire to the movie, where rather than being a kind of mincing satire with a gay vampire, the movie has turned into a much darker satire of the Western.
Of the whole Western.
Where implicating the horror genre allows, so basically, ultimately, Drake Roby, he's not really an outsider. It turns out his family was there longer than the fucking, the Anglo-Saxon or, European runoff characters who have now settled there and bought the easy grants after the Spanish-American War.
Do you know what the setting of this movie is? Because Robles was
it
around
must be it must be New Mexico or
1856?
It must be, it's like, so
Robles
is from the 1860s, so it must be in early 20th century.
Had to be, because how can he just disintegrate into dust, right?
Well, I admit I didn't pay very much attention to, like,
I said, wait a minute, how recent are we? We're still horse and buggy yet. You know what I mean? So,
well, I guess the only real answer is that it's Hollywood, so it's this dream, and it's a science fiction horror movie. It's like it's a dreamland.
It works.
Yeah, and it works, but, like, it's the thing where it's like, so even that aspect of it where Drake Roby, Drago Robles, he becomes a manifestation of what is always implicit in the kind of pretenses of law and justice. That, like,
But he played, and that's why he's so effective as a character, because he does appeal to your... I found, well, obviously it's written to be him as the more fascinating character. Yeah. You have the sniveling, the con man, Buffer, who clearly is on one side. You have the ridiculous, effeminate idiot preacher Dan, who seems not fleshed out enough. And then you have the sheriff, who's somewhat the counterbalance to Buffer. He's the lawman who recognizes that his position is limited in terms of how much law he can actually enforce.
Well, it's
And-
not about how much law he can enforce.
no,
it's the restrictions that the law places on him
Yeah.
purely as a matter of pretense.
But not only that, but the idea is that if you call someone in a duel, if they draw on you have the right to defend yourself. I get
right,
your point.
Yeah.
And he's limited. That's why he says, don't listen to him. Walk out the door when
Tim
Tim
is trying
Carter
to-
is goading
yeah,
him.
yeah.
Right?
Goading Buffer, yeah.
Right?
Yeah. But again, the dark dramatic irony of the movie is coming out, and which is, again, there's so much dramatic irony to the movie that it really reinforces the inability to really connect with or empathize with these characters, because the audience is now placed at a point of such dramatic distance where we realize, oh, Tim is totally in the wrong. Buffer didn't kill his father. He just thinks he is, and now, like, you know, it's like there's this
Right.
this movie has such a fascinating sort of capsule exploration of like masculinity, where so much of the film is about male characters trying to rise to the moment and measure up
I don't know.
in the
Yeah.
sort of absurd like diorama of a Western
That's right. It's a
lawless
diorama.
world.
I love that term. I love that term. A diorama where you have all the animals of the nature in one
Yeah,
shot,
exactly.
which doesn't exist. And you're right. That's exactly. I never thought of that. That's exactly what it is. In fact, Buffer's character is somewhat sympathetic to me. Is he telling the truth when he says, "What am I supposed to do?" He came in, he busted up things, and I didn't know. I was damming up the stream to make a lake. It's open now. It's flowing freely. So Buffer is Buffer telling the truth? I mean, and you feel for everybody. All of a sudden, you're starting to feel for everybody, and everybody's the loser here. It seems
Right.
to me. So she gets,
And that's the
she gets
and I
with
guess
the-
that's the ultimate problem.
she
because,
gets to be with the flat preacher Dan. Now Robles is dead. The sheriff
and
is
live
dead.
a horrible sexless life without the
Well,
passion of
whatever.
her
Whatever.
lover.
Yeah, and everybody's dead except.
But here's the thing: all the bad people are only dead because Roby got rid of them. Like that's the thing and that's the really
No, Gordon got. Well, you're right. Right.
And
right.
and that's the thing is that the most that anyone says to Buffer, and I think Preacher Dan's line is very good in this regard because he tells Buffer, "You're worse than Drake Roby," because even though Drake Roby is a hired gun, even though he makes money killing people, you're the type of person who makes people rely on people like that.
Right.
You're just such an awful creep that people
Right.
are willing to trust
Yeah,
anything in order to establish some kind of order.
Preacher Dan is sort of like the interlocutor.
Right.
That's why I love
And
what
that's-
you said
yeah.
when you said it's a diorama. He's the interlocutor that comes on stage and explains what's going on. He's the guy that finds the diary and reads what happened. I wish they would have just eliminated that whole part and maybe drew it out, maybe through a soliloquy or a dialogue
Right.
of Jake Roby when he finally confronts Preacher Dan and tells him what happened and and then trying to appeal to his sympathy. That would have been a much better scene than having the flashback kind of thing. I felt that to be a drawback in the film.
Yeah, and I think
It
the
never
thing,
works,
yeah,
right?
the thing,
Voiceovers and drawbacks.
Well, that's the thing is that Preacher Dan, he is, ultimately what the film is working towards is that moment where he does strap on the gun belt and he participates in exactly the sort of society and spectacle that he's spent the entire rest of the movie haranguing against. It's just that he's finally found, just like every other character, he's finally found the mechanism for sublimating what is really just the thing that is inside his heart all along.
Well, it
which
looks like
he feels castrated by Roby. He feels pushed
Yeah, he's gotta
out.
he's gotta
He
pushed
feels
out,
like
right.
something that's
Yeah.
rightfully his has been taken.
Right.
And now he's just going to use the pretexts that are at his disposal, the rationale at his disposal, to make sense of it.
Yeah, and if you noticed, strangely, his belt is cantered down, that he's totally out of his
Yeah.
element to do what he's doing.
Yeah, as soon as he's coming out of the church, it's interesting.
It's like,
he
look,
comes.
his pants are down.
Yeah, because
it's
when Drake shows up ready to find him, he's coming out of the church. Yeah, you're right. He's putting on the belt, which immediately conjures up the image of, like you said, having his pants down,
Right,
like
yeah.
he's tying his belt rather than.
and it's cantered, and I think there's a lot that the directors wanted in this film that aren't accidental. I mean, as you just
Right.
mentioned, there's a lot of things in here, and that's what, as an older person seeing it, I really enjoyed it. But I see the pitfalls. There's pitfalls all through, but they're not real major ones. But the other thing is that there's no one you really can hang on to, but you feel sympathy with just about everybody except for the preacher. I don't feel any sympathy for him. Everybody else.
Well, yeah, he's an oaf. He's just an impotent cretin who just spends the entire time condescending to people. And that's the thing is that, yeah, Drake Roby, he is, he's the manifestation of everything this society deleteriously leads to. But when Preacher Dan tells Buffer, it's
color. His color.
Yeah, exactly. He has something he has a passion that's connecting you to some sort of human emotion.
He's bloodless, but he has blood.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
It's real. I mean,
he does it.
And Drake Roby, Michael Pate's is a halfway decent character. I mean, he's played cops in other movies and series.
I mean, I think he's quite good in this movie.
Yeah.
It's just, and especially when you compare him to not only contemporary Western anti-heroes. I find this character, obviously it's a vampire, so it's got that heightened sort of pulp aspect to it. But I find a movie like Curse of the Undead a far more sort of effective allegorical confrontation with the mythologization of the West that is associated with the revisionist Western than with, say, The Searchers or Shane. Because those movies, and I think it's because those movies are such bigger budget spectacles. They're these full color, sweeping CinemaScope movies. They have this, despite the fact that they're trying to sort of subvert aspects of Western mythology, they're also sort of endemically tailored to this romantic mythopoetic scope that kind of undermines that effect. Whereas Curse of the Undead literally is just this rinky-dink, shot in a couple weeks, written off horror movie by a studio that had literally just had to shut down a couple months before because they were in such a bad financial situation. It's the exact sort of thing that makes it so hard for Edward Dein and Mildred Dein to really develop the sort of much more cerebral film that they were clearly going for, is also the thing that is its greatest strength in the context of the Western, because now you have this subversion of the Western archetypes and the Western mythology, but in a context that allows you to observe it in a completely stark, almost ascetic manner. There are no extraneous or embellished or gratuitous details.
All the shots are not.
Everything
there's tight. Tight shots.
Everything is mercenary. There are so many long takes. So many scenes of this movie are done in one long take. And it'll just be accomplished by Edward Dein simply moving the camera to create a new shot. It's almost Spielbergian in a way, or prototypical of what Steven Spielberg would do.
I didn't know there aren't too. Well, there are. Yeah, there are the shots where. Yeah, you're right. There are single take, and yeah, exactly. Yes, there are single take shots in a lot of it where it moves around like that. I never. The only one I could think about is when they're having the discussion, and it goes from here and it pans right to them as a close-up. It's one moving shot.
Yeah, but that's the thing. He does that trick a lot where he'll start in wide, but then he'll very slowly push in. So now we're in a two-shot, and then he'll push in even further. Now we're in a close-up. He does that, or he'll pan or something. He does that all the time. And it's remarkably effective at giving even these very sort of stagey, because so much of the movie is just people arguing about law and sin and morality and stuff like that. It does give a nice momentum, a visual excitement to the movie, even though there really is a paucity of the things that
and it's noticeable.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. And then scenes where you want to see more, like the coffin scenes, and he doesn't show you.
Yeah, it's just but that's the thing. It's
you want to look down like this. You're going up. You're sitting in your chair, looking down to see if you can actually look down over the film, and you can't because he's panning. He's not doing it. So I mean, he draws you in through the technique.
And then besides the revisionist Western, I also think that Michael Pate as a character in a horror film, in a vampire movie, is a very interesting vampire character. I think he's a very fascinating figure, precisely because there is that this melodramatic plot really does allow for a expansion upon that sort of weird identification with the vampire, this identification with, like you say, the monster who is governed completely by a passion and the sort of unconscious animal mind.
Right, the drive.
And like, you know, you instantly compare it to like Christopher Lee in Horror of Dracula. Like, I'm not putting down Christopher Lee's performance, but I do find Michael Pate's Drake Roby to be a far more compelling vampire character dramatically, because I think what
Well, I think that you mentioned, I was ready to say that Christopher Lee, one of the drawbacks of Christopher Lee films, although he's an excellent actor, is the fact that there isn't any of this.
Yeah, there's a one-dimensionality.
One of the most important scenes in Horror of Dracula is the first scene where Jonathan Harker, and he comes down there talking about the library, that he's going to be the librarian to do his books.
Right.
On a pretense that he's going to kill Dracula. Then it's gone. Then after that, all you do is have Christopher Lee in a series of non-dialogue shots of being the creature. And, you know, that's what gives the appeal to Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Right, the sort of sympathetic
Yeah,
qualities
there's more,
to him.
exactly. And this is a forerunner of that.
Yeah.
This is a forerunner of that, if you will.
Yeah, definitely. Interview with a Vampire as well. Yeah.
Interview with a Vampire, another example. Exactly, where there's and that's a long movie, right? It's almost 3 hours or more than that. And so that I always enjoy that movie. It's not boring to me to watch an Interview with a Vampire, because again, you flesh out the no pun intended, you flesh out the characters are fleshed out. They have more of a dynamism to them. And here, you see that in
it's not perfectly fulfilled, but you get it. You get it. Well, this is like the brunch on the way to the lunch of like those later sympathetic vampire movies. You don't get exactly what you get at breakfast, or you don't get exactly what you get at lunch, but you get a good meal out of the 80 minutes of Curse of the Undead. I found it a thoroughly enjoyable movie.
I did too, and I think it's something that people, like I said, you don't see it. It's never. I haven't seen it on TCM since I was a kid. I haven't seen this movie, so I think it's important for people to watch it.
Yeah, luckily, Kino Lorber has put out a nice new restoration of it on Blu-ray, so people can finally.
Did we see that one?
Yes, that's the version we're watching.
That's why it looks so great.
Yeah, that's why it looks so great. So people are finally able to.
It beats rabbit ears.
Yeah. So yeah, and that's the thing is that, like, you know, in the annals of Universal's third cycle of horror and sci-fi movies, I hope in the future that Curse of the Undead gets the same kind of attention that, say, The Incredible Shrinking Man does, or It Came from Outer Space, because this is an example of one of the more cerebral, and again, in that sort of weird kind of symbolic way in the crypt scenes, in the way that the filmmakers seem to be alluding to Val Lewton a little bit, in terms of like the clearly unfulfilled ideas they have of like trying to make stuff a little bit more implied. Like, that's another thing. In the original screenplay, we're not supposed to see Roby's face until he appears during when Dolores is hanging up the posters looking for a lone gunman. We're in the flashback scene, we're not supposed to see his face until he's attacking his father, Don Robles. So like implicitly, like, you know, in that scene it was supposed to be like that line between, okay, is this the memory of Don Robles, or is this Preacher Dan seeing what he wants to see? Is he conjuring up this idea that there's this whole idea that, again, these things that fall by the wayside for these filmmakers who weren't really able to develop it exactly the way they wanted, either in terms of the aesthetics of the film or in the very politically incorrect for both the time and or sort of in retrospect that they were kind of trying to explore with this movie. But nonetheless, I hope it's appreciated more so, because I think for a late entry and for a very low budget entry, even by the standards of Universal's third cycle of horror and sci-fi, very fascinating movie, very interesting and absurdly watchable. You know, just
who's the director of photography on it?
L.S.W. Carter. Very good stuff. I think, like, nice layering of shadows, nice,
that whole scene in the silent and the whole black and white scene of where he's being chased in the black and white.
Yeah, that's the
darkness and
scene I was
shadows.
thinking of in terms of like the allusion to Val Luton. Like that's a very Luton-esque chase scene where you don't see Roby
And you don't know
very
what you're,
much.
and the sound is coming from everywhere, so you don't know exactly where you're
yeah,
supposed to run.
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah, very like cat people, leopard man stuff.
Yes,
yeah,
yes,
yeah.
absolutely right. Yeah.
But that'll
That's
do
good.
it for our Halloween episode. Thank you guys for enjoying another episode. We'll be coming back next week. We'll be returning. Well, actually, what do you want to do next week? Do you want to return to the Mad Doctor cycle, or do you want to do a special episode for the patrons on the continuing adventures of Schmuck Dracula, Billy the Kid versus Dracula?
I don't know. Well, I don't know. I can't make a decision on it.
It doesn't seem like you can't make a decision. It seems like you like there's a pain that's crossing your face as I say, should we watch Billy the Kid versus Dracula? All right, so if it's not Billy the Kid versus Dracula, we'll be coming back with the Mad Doctor cycle. Boris Karloff coming back once again.
Right. Before I hang.
Before I hang. So we're already retreating from the escalations of the Man with 9 Lives and the man they could not hang. We're now admitting, all right, this is before I hang. We're already
raising the stakes,
compromising our estimates. You know, we're. But yeah, thank you for joining us in another exciting episode of Monster. Yeah, trick or treat, baby, on a night like this, as Chuck Berry used to say.